The studio lights burned hot, but the real heat came when Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett reached for a thin folder and shattered Melania Trump's carefully crafted silence. What began as polite debate erupted into a televised reckoning over power, marriage, and truth, and when Crockett exposed the bombshell inside, America asked how much was hidden all along. Before we get to this explosive moment, tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe truth still matters, hit subscribe. We've got another jaw-dropping story coming tomorrow. The broadcast was live, Sunday primetime, the kind of slot where silence itself could feel like scandal. The DC studio glowed beneath relentless lights, the half-moon desk set so the two women, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett in cobalt, Melania Trump in ivory, sat framed in deliberate contrast. Behind them, the audience disappeared into shadow, hushed, while the red tally light burned at the edge of the camera like a warning flare. Moderator Paul Whitfield cleared his throat, eager to keep the conversation inside familiar lines of policy and performance. He asked about federal funding for ceremonial roles, the sort of soft pitch meant to avoid bruises, but as he spoke, the cameras caught something else. Jasmine's hand resting calmly atop a thin, slate-colored folder, fingers tapping lightly, a rhythm like a metronome keeping time. Her voice, when it came, was low and precise. "Transparency applies to everyone who uses public resources," she said evenly, "even those who live at the White House." The line landed like a dropped gavel. Melania's chin lifted, elegant and rigid, while her hands, interlaced on the desk, clasped tighter. Paul blinked and tried to redirect, but the shift in energy was undeniable. Jasmine didn't raise her voice, didn't accuse. She framed. "This isn't gossip," she continued. "It's documentation." The word hung heavy, its weight clear to anyone watching. The audience leaned forward, the subtle shuffle of anticipation rustling like dry leaves in the dark. Paul pressed to intervene, but Jasmine laid the folder flat, a gesture both quiet and defiant. "A 2018 postnuptial amendment," she said, "with public-facing obligations, timing, and payments tied directly to image management during official travel." For a fraction of a second, Melania's practiced mask faltered. Her lips parted, then closed, her eyes narrowing in controlled disbelief. A flicker of something, anger, fear, or calculation, cut through the porcelain surface. Paul's hand lifted, desperate for a commercial break, but the moment had already carved itself into memory. He called it too late. The screen dissolved to black, and the studio buzz swelled into chaos. Within seconds, social captions exploded across feeds. Not gossip recedes, Postnup papers, truth on air. And America, already braced for spectacle, knew something more than entertainment had just broken wide open. The drama unfolding under primetime lights didn't begin in that studio. To understand its weight, you had to understand Jasmine Crockett and Melania Trump not just as public figures, but as two women shaped by radically different worlds, colliding under one roof of American politics. Jasmine Crockett's path was built on friction. Raised in a working-class neighborhood in Dallas, she grew up watching her mother juggle multiple jobs and her father navigate the bureaucracy of veteran benefits. Those nights listening to whispered arguments about bills weren't just childhood memories. They were an education in survival. Jasmine wasn't groomed for politics by donors or dynasties. She was sharpened by courtrooms where clients paid in folded bills or couldn't pay at all. As a civil rights attorney, she argued with receipts, timelines, and evidence. Every motion, every objection came with a folder. That habit, never speaking without paper in hand, would one day define her political persona. Melania Trump, by contrast, entered the American stage from the world of glossy surfaces. Her career was a symphony of camera shutters, glossy spreads, and cultivated mystique. Born in Slovenia, she became fluent in the currency of beauty and discretion long before she became fluent in English. To her admirers, she embodied grace under pressure. To critics, silence that veiled privilege. Her marriage to Donald Trump wasn't just personal. It tethered her to the machinery of political celebrity, where private contracts could carry public consequences. When Jasmine set the folder on the table that night, it wasn't just about paperwork. It was a symbol of two philosophies. For Jasmine, transparency meant justice. For Melania, privacy meant survival. The collision wasn't just personal, it was systemic. What happens when two women from opposite realities are forced to define the word truth on live television? In the days before the broadcast, whispers had circulated about Jasmine preparing something unexpected. Staffers noticed her in committee rooms late into the night, flipping through documents, highlighting margins, whispering with aides. But she wasn't after tabloid scandal. She was after the connective tissue, proof that personal contracts inside the White House had public consequences. Melania, meanwhile, was briefed to stay elegant, untouchable. Her team reminded her, deflect, demur, never dignify with detail. But the folder was a detail in itself, sitting like a silent dare. In that moment, Melania's image, built over decades of managing silence, was suddenly vulnerable to something far sharper: Jasmine's precision. And that's where the spark truly lay. Not just in the folder's contents, but in the idea that one woman had weaponized documentation against another whose life was built on keeping documents sealed. To see how they reached this clash, you had to rewind to 2018, the year etched into the folder now haunting the desk. That year, the Trump presidency was at full tilt. Chaos in headlines, constant turnover in staff, and a first lady who was both ever-present and curiously distant. Reports swirled then of Melania renegotiating the terms of her marriage in light of new political realities. Insiders whispered about a post-nuptial agreement timed around official travel schedules and image management obligations. Few could pin down details, but in Washington, where rumor fuels entire industries, the whispers were enough to spark speculation. Jasmine Crockett wasn't in Congress then. She was grinding in Texas courtrooms, representing clients against eviction notices, navigating immigration cases for families who carried more paperwork than possessions. She didn't know the exact shape of Melania's private contract, but she knew the pattern. Those with power write rules for themselves, while those without power carry folders filled with consequences. When Jasmine later entered Congress, those patterns collided with access. A staffer passed along an overlooked document during a broader investigation into resource allegation for official travel. What looked like bureaucratic paperwork revealed itself as part of something larger: amendments that blurred the line between personal image and public expense. Jasmine didn't immediately move. She filed it, cross-referenced, waited. Timing, in politics, was everything. By 2022, the folder had grown thicker. Notes, timelines, corroborating details. Jasmine built it brick by brick, the way she built every case she had ever argued. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about a principle she carried from her earliest cases. If the public pays, the public deserves to know. For Melania, those years carried a different rhythm. She learned to treat silence as armor. When critics demanded statements, she withheld. When journalists pressed, she deflected with elegance. That cultivated restraint became her strength, a performance of composure in a world that thrives on noise. But beneath the surface, silence requires constant maintenance. Each clause of that post-nuptial agreement, each amendment, was part of the scaffolding that kept the image intact. By the time the broadcast lights flared in 2024, both women were carrying legacies into the studio. Jasmine's folder was not a last-minute stunt. It was years in the making, an extension of how she saw justice. Melania's silence was not weakness. It was her most disciplined art, a choice honed across continents and decades. And so, when the red tally light flicked on, and Jasmine's hand tapped that quiet rhythm atop the folder, America wasn't just watching two women. It was watching two histories collide. One built on speaking with receipts, the other on surviving without them. The lights burned hot as Paul Whitfield leaned forward, eager to steer the conversation back to policy talking points. But the room had already shifted. Viewers at home might not have noticed yet, but inside the studio, the air had thinned, the audience caught in the gravitational pull of the folder beneath Jasmine Crockett's hand. "But Congresswoman," Paul pressed, "the question was about fiscal priorities." Jasmine's voice stayed low, deliberate. "And priorities begin with honesty. If the public funds the stage, they deserve to know." if it's being used as a theater. Her hand tapped once more on the folder, like a metronome marking time, building tension. Melania's chin lifted. She didn't flinch, not yet. "This is inappropriate," she said, her accent soft but her tone clipped. "My life is not for your political theater." The audience stirred. Jasmine didn't blink. "I'm not talking about your private life, Mrs. Trump. I'm talking about obligations tied to official travel. Receipts, timelines, documentation. This isn't gossip, it's governance." Paul tried to pivot, but Jasmine pressed. She opened the folder with quiet precision. Papers fanned out like a courtroom exhibit. "Here we have a postnuptial amendment from 2018. It specifies image management during international trips, including stipulations about how appearances would be staged, timed, and supported with public resources. That's not a tabloid headline. That's a taxpayer issue." The words landed like a body blow. The audience gasped, not because of lurid detail, but because of the cold formality of what Jasmine had just exposed. For years, rumors swirled. Tonight, someone had put pages to whispers. Melania's composure faltered for the briefest second, a twitch in her jaw. But she steadied, smoothing her palms together. "These are personal matters," she said. "Every marriage has agreements. This is nothing unusual." Jasmine didn't move, her eyes locked on Melania's. When agreements shape how the public's money is spent, they stop being personal. They become political. That's the line, and that's why we're here. Paul raised his hand, trying to cut tension with commercial timing. But the moment had already burned itself into television history. The red tally light kept glowing, daring anyone to look away. The studio audience was split, some murmuring, others frozen, silent. Hashtags were already rising online. Not gossip screens, Postnup papers, truth on air. And in that instant, it was no longer about two women sitting under stage lights. It was about the clash between silence and disclosure, between an image preserved and a truth documented. Melania's voice came quieter this time, but sharp. "You think you can embarrass me with papers? You think America cares about this?" Jasmine leaned forward, her tone steady. "America cares about truth, and truth doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be seen." The break cue came late. Too late. The confrontation had already begun. When the cameras came back, the studio no longer felt like a debate hall. It felt like a courtroom. Silent, taut, and waiting for testimony. Jasmine's folder lay open, the edges of paper catching the glow of stage lights. Melania sat rigid, her hands clasped so tightly they whitened her knuckles. Paul cleared his throat. "Let's keep this grounded in policy, please." Jasmine turned slightly, her gaze firm but calm. "Policy is exactly what we're talking about. If we normalize exceptions for those closest to power, we create two systems of accountability, one for the connected and one for everyone else." Melania's voice broke the hush, sharp and cutting. "You don't know what it is to live under constant scrutiny. You don't know the cruelty of people who dissect your every gesture, every word. Agreements like this are not scandal. They are protection." The audience shifted. For a brief moment, sympathy flickered in the room, until Jasmine spoke again, not with attack, but with memory. "I know what it is to live under scrutiny," Jasmine said quietly. "I've represented families who carried entire lives in a single folder. Birth certificates, eviction notices, deportation threats. Their privacy was never optional. Their paperwork wasn't protection, it was survival. That's the difference." The silence deepened. Melania's breath came shorter. For the first time, the gloss of her composure cracked, replaced by something raw, frustration, maybe fear. "You think this makes you righteous?" Melania's accent thickened under strain. "You sit here, a politician attacking another woman, shameful?" Jasmine didn't rise to it. Instead, she lifted a single page, angled toward the camera. "This isn't about attacking you. This is about asking, why should personal image clauses be tied to official, taxpayer-funded travel? Why should public money underwrite private contracts? The camera zoomed, the words on the page blurred, but the highlighted lines were visible. Enough for the country to know this wasn't smoke, it was fire. The audience gasped again. On social media, captions flew like sparks. Memes bloomed mid-broadcast. Commentators were already pausing their dinners to dial in for live analysis. Paul tried to salvage order, but his voice sounded small against the seismic shift underway. Melania leaned in now, her voice rising. This is not your business. This is between husband and wife. Jasmine's reply was calm, resolute. No, Mrs. Trump. This is between power and the public. That's always the business of democracy. The words hung in the air like a gavel drop. Melania recoiled slightly, lips pressing shut. She had built a fortress of silence for decades, but Jasmine had found the weak seam when silence crossed into the realm of the public's right to know. The mask had slipped, and for the first time, the country was seeing Melania not as untouchable, but as cornered. By the final segment, the studio felt electric, buzzing with the weight of something irreversible. The audience wasn't fidgeting anymore. They were holding their breath. Paul opened cautiously. We can close this discussion here unless either of you wants to offer a final remark. Jasmine waited. She didn't need to rush. Power sometimes dissolves not in the shout, but in the pause. Finally, she leaned toward the mic. Here's what matters. Transparency doesn't humiliate anyone. It humbles everyone equally. That's the point of democracy. Melania's eyes flashed. She had been composed, restrained, trained to turn silence into armor. But under the bright lights, armor can look like glass. She snapped. You think you're so brave? You are nothing but noise. You think you can sit there and lecture me about democracy? My life is not yours to dissect. Her voice cracked, louder than she had ever allowed it on television. Gasps erupted across the audience. Paul froze, his script forgotten. Jasmine stayed still, almost sorrowful. This was never about your private marriage, Mrs. Trump. This was about a system that bends rules for those who live in palaces, while telling everyone else to accept the scraps. That's what people are tired of. That's what we can't keep hiding behind silence. Melania shook her head, words tumbling now, unmeasured. You don't know what it takes to survive in that house, with that man, with that name. You don't know what it costs to stay. The audience hushed again, stunned by the accidental revelation. In that moment, Melania had admitted what silence had always tried to conceal. That, even within luxury, there were chains. Jasmine lowered her voice. Then you understand cost better than most. Which is why this matters. Because every hidden contract, every clause, every exception, it all tells regular people that truth is negotiable. And it's not. Melania sat back, trembling now, but unable to recover the pristine calm she had carried in. The image was broken. The public had seen what was never meant for them. Paul finally intervened, his voice faltering. We have to cut to break. But it was already too late. The confrontation had reached its crescendo. As the cameras pulled back, hashtags flooded every corner of the digital world. Melania meltdown. Receipts speak. Truth v. silence. And in living rooms, union halls, dormitories, and churches across America, people replayed Jasmine's words. It wasn't just political theater anymore. It was a reckoning. A demand for truth in a country exhausted by silence. The broadcast ended, but the confrontation had only just begun. The broadcast hadn't even reached its closing credits before the hashtags erupted across every platform. What began as a few ironic posts mocking Sunday night contract law suddenly detonated into a wave of threads, memes, and think pieces. The first hashtag to climb the trending charts was Postnup papers. At first, it carried the sting of parody. Clips of celebrities holding envelopes, TikToks with couples acting out absurd marriage contracts, spliced audio of Melania's frozen reaction looped over dance tracks. But by morning, the tone shifted. What had been mockery hardened into something more serious, a conversation about privilege, power, and the hidden intersections of private agreements with public responsibilities. Cable news amplified it. Networks ran loops of Jasmine Crockett's precise words. "This isn't gossip, it's documentation." On-screen chyrons pressed the framing question. Privacy or public interest? Anchors leaned forward, voices pitched to suggest gravitas, debating whether the exposure of a postnuptial clause tied to official travel expenses constituted a legitimate act of oversight or an intrusion into family boundaries. Footage of the folder resting silently on the studio desk ran side by side with B-roll of motorcades, overseas hotel suites, and press conferences where Melania once stood front and center. The question was no longer only about Crockett versus Melania. It was about where the personal shield ended and the taxpayer's right to know began. Late-night comedians, never ones to waste a viral scandal, seized it instantly. They joked about America spending its Sunday night collectively Googling, "What is a postnuptial agreement?" One popular host quipped that America had discovered a new national pastime, armchair contract law. Laughter roared, but just as quickly writers' rooms pivoted. Beneath the humor lay an unease, because Jasmine's reveal had not been about gossip, but about systems, and in that context, the jokes became double-edged. You could laugh at the absurdity, but you couldn't escape the sting of the question underneath. Meanwhile, explainer podcasts, YouTube legal breakdowns, and Substack newsletters went into overdrive. Experts dissected the mechanics of postnups versus prenups, outlined what clauses might mean for federal obligations, and compared past cases where public officials blurred lines between private family arrangements and taxpayer resources. One viral TikTok stitched together side-by-side visuals: ICE agents raiding family homes, immigrant children in processing centers, and glossy clips of Melania stepping off Air Force One in couture outfits. The caption read, "Who pays for the image?" Academics joined in. Law professors at Georgetown, Columbia, and Berkeley used Jasmine's Sunday night clip as a teaching tool. In classrooms, students replayed the exchange, analyzing Crockett's phrasing, how she avoided accusation, how she separated personal dignity from systemic scrutiny. Civics teachers in high schools clipped the 30-second moment and played it for their students, asking whether transparency applies equally to those in proximity to the presidency. Within days, the clip was included in resource packets for ethics and governance courses. For Jasmine, the media detonation was both a validation and a burden. Her team fielded calls from every major outlet. Rena, her communications director, had to balance invitations for morning show appearances with the risk of overexposure. Jasmine's strategy was to let the clip speak for itself, declining multiple interview requests. She knew the strength of the moment lay in its silence. The calm, precise delivery followed by the country filling in the blanks. The detonation was cultural, academic, and political. A folder had been placed on a table, and suddenly America was having a full-blown seminar on the ethics of marriage contracts when public money is involved. What began as parody ended as pedagogy, and in that unlikely transformation, Jasmine's clip transcended scandal. It became a prism through which the nation examined power itself. If the media had been the ignition, the public became the fuel. By Monday afternoon, cafeteria tables buzzed with arguments that sounded like courtroom cross-examinations. At a truck stop diner in Oklahoma, one waitress told another she had no right bringing up a man's marriage. The cook interjected, "But if it's tied to our taxes, don't we get to know?" In a barbershop in Detroit, clippers hummed, while regulars debated whether Jasmine had crossed a sacred boundary or finally pulled back the curtain on hypocrisy. At pastors' breakfasts and Sunday night fellowship circles, sermons pivoted to the theme of privacy. Some clergy condemned Jasmine, calling it an attack on family. Others praised her courage, framing the moment as a biblical defense of truth over concealment. The divide wasn't neatly partisan. It cut across geography, faith, and family dynamics. Flash polls only deepened the story. Independents leaned toward uncomfortable but necessary. The GOP base hardened, calling the moment a personal low blow. Moderates stalled, unsure whether to applaud Jasmine's fearlessness or recoil from the personal angle. Headlines crystallized the ambivalence. Line crosser or line meander. Inside Jasmine's world, the inbox overflowed. Hate mail, threats, and memes mocking her flooded in. But so did gratitude. Handwritten letters arrived in manila envelopes, some from towns Jasmine had never visited. One from Des Moines read, "I'm an immigrant housekeeper. My husband and I carry our papers everywhere, like armor. Thank you for asking. Who else should?" From El Paso, "When my brother was detained, we begged for transparency. You demanded it on national TV." From Yuma, "They call you out of line. But some of us know. Lines are drawn to keep people like us out." Rena read each one carefully, filing them by hand, understanding that in those quiet voices lay the stakes of the debate. Generational lenses sharpened the split. Younger voters dominated TikTok with clips remixing Jasmine's calm delivery into montages about systems of privilege. They saw her as exposing not a marriage, but an infrastructure. Older voters, many of whom tuned into traditional cable news, focused on tone and decorum. "It's not what she said, it's how she said it," became a refrain. And yet, even in that divide, a shared recognition persisted. The clip had been surgical. Even critics acknowledged that Jasmine had not shouted or slung rumors. She had spoken with measured precision. The nation's living rooms became miniature political debate stages. Families split across dinner tables. Parents scolded daughters for applauding Jasmine. Daughters reminded parents that integrity should not end at the White House gates. Text threads among college students and retirees alike filled with memes, think pieces, and Bible verses. The public split wasn't chaos, it was chorus. Every voice from the diner cook to the high school teacher became part of a larger reckoning. Jasmine's act had not ended at the studio. It had spilled into the bloodstream of America's daily life. And that, more than any poll, showed the power of her choice. She had made the nation decide whether truth was decorum's enemy or its only defender. By midweek, the consequences reached the marble floors of government. Representative Earl Maddox, eager to capitalize on outrage, filed a motion to censure Jasmine Crockett. By noon, 47 signers had already inked their names. Cable news tracked the tally like it was Super Tuesday, splashing countdown graphics and predicting fireworks when the motion hit the House floor. In the West Wing, panic met discipline. A staff memo circulated late Tuesday night urging all surrogates to avoid ad-libbing on marriage matters and to stick to policy scripts. Yet within hours, a second memo leaked. This one, signed off by mid-level comm staffer Abigail Roy, stated plainly that the First Lady prefers no further mention of postnuptial agreements or their conditions. The leak was gasoline. Headlines screamed, "She wants out, he doubles down." Suddenly, the story wasn't only about Jasmine's revelation, it was about the fractures inside the White House. The leak cycle churned for days. White House counsel scrambled to reassure allies there had been no wrongdoing, insisting postnuptial agreements were private matters. But ethics committees in Congress quietly began requesting reconciliations of travel expenses. Legal analysts noted that while no law had clearly been broken, the optics threatened to erode the administration's moral standing. Meanwhile, momentum grew outside government walls. Small but fervent rallies sprang up in Albuquerque, Miami, Wichita, and Bakersfield. Protesters carried handmade signs that read, "We're not invisible," and "Public money, public answers." They were not massive marches, but their symbolism was undeniable. The participants weren't professional activists, they were nurses, welders, students, and retirees who saw themselves in the metaphor of carrying papers like armor. They came not for gossip, but for equality. Inside committee rooms, quiet chatter grew louder. Some members floated the possibility of new ethics rules clarifying how public funds intersect with spousal arrangements. Staffers whispered about precedent, citing past controversies where private lives overlapped with public spending. Cable producers salivated at the thought of a floor fight, drafting chyrons before the vote was even scheduled. Through it all, Jasmine remained steady. She issued no fiery statements, no cable appearances, no social media rants. Her silence became its own form of discipline, allowing the institutions themselves to writhe under the weight of their contradictions. Allies warned her of the censor's dangers, but Jasmine only replied, "They can vote to punish me. They can't vote away the truth." By the end of the week, the ripples had become waves. Government, media, and the public sphere were all tangled in the fallout of one folder, one sentence, one calm assertion on live television. The confrontation had left the studio, traveled through the media bloodstream, divided households, and now pressed against the very framework of American institutions. The question remained unresolved, but its force was undeniable. When the private life of power is funded by the public, who draws the line? The morning after the primetime eruption, the digital ecosystem was already ablaze. Hashtags weren't just trending, they were mutating into full-scale campaigns. Postnup papers branched into receipts on air had not private if public, and even the biting contract first lady. TikTok feeds stitched Jasmine's calm tone with Melania's tightening grip on her clasped hands, replaying the shift in expression as though it were a Zapruder film for a new generation. Meme culture did the rest. Side-by-side frames showed the pristine folder next to White House holiday cards, captions reading, "One lasts longer than the other." It wasn't just entertainment, it was narrative warfare. By midday, influencers who rarely touched politics were posting. Beauty vloggers spoke of image management as labor. Fitness coaches riffed on contracts for public performance, and young attorneys produced breakdowns of what a postnuptial agreement even meant in practice. The crossover effect was staggering. A legal disclosure born from a congressional debate had seeped into lifestyle content, gaming streams, and relationship podcasts. Everyone had an angle, everyone had a take, and Jasmine Crockett's clip was the gravitational center pulling them in. Cultural critics noted the eerie overlap with generational struggles. They argued the folder symbolized a broader American anxiety, that private choices of elites are subsidized by public money, while working families can't shield themselves from scrutiny or penalties. A barber in Atlanta went viral himself when he said into his phone camera, "My cousin got cut off food stamps over a paperwork mistake. Don't tell me her postnup is off limits when we pay for hair chuck." The clip, raw and simple, rocketed across platforms, underlining Jasmine's point more than any think tank report could. Meanwhile, the entertainment world embraced the chaos. Late-night hosts joked about Sunday night contract law, while comedians framed the debate as The Bachelor meets the Constitution. Yet the laughs carried an undertone. Was the humor just an easier way to digest what was otherwise a brutal critique of privilege? On college campuses, debates sprang up in student unions, professors assigning the viral clip as a case study in media ethics. Civics classrooms played the segment to teenagers who, for the first time, asked about public versus private duties in government families. Jasmine's words had traveled from a polished studio into every crevice of American life, sparking arguments that didn't die when the screen turned off. The cultural fallout wasn't just noise. It shifted what counted as fair game in political debate. The line between private dignity and public accountability was being redrawn, not by elites behind closed doors, but by millions of ordinary people deciding, post by post, whose silence mattered more. If the cultural storm was messy, the political and institutional aftershocks were surgical. Congressional inboxes flooded with pressure from both sides. Jasmine Crockett's office needed a triage system, threatening voicemails, but also thank you notes, written in careful cursive from towns like Yuma and Salinas. One retired schoolteacher wrote, "For years I carried every mortgage paper, every tax receipt, every green card copy, terrified someone would say I didn't belong. Thank you for saying out loud that rules can't just disappear for the powerful." Staffers passed that letter hand to hand, quietly moved. Inside the Republican ranks, the split was visceral. Earl Maddox, never one to miss an opportunity, moved forward with a censure motion, calling Jasmine's revelation an attack on the dignity of the First Lady. Yet even as he thundered on cable news, other GOP members privately admitted that the optics were brutal. They feared voters outside the base would see them as shielding privilege, rather than defending family. Flash polls confirmed the danger. Independents leaned toward Jasmine's framing, describing it as uncomfortable but fair. Moderates stalled, uncertain how to spin a confrontation where the documentation appeared so tangible. The White House communications team scrambled. Leaks emerged of memos urging officials to stay on script and avoid off-the-cuff comments on marriage or contracts. That second memo, mentioning that the First Lady herself preferred no further references, only worsened the storm. Headlines blared, "Melania wants out. Trump doubles down." That narrative of a first lady fatigued by exposure and a president insisting on counterattack fractured the image of unity the administration had tried so carefully to maintain. Suddenly, the contract revelation wasn't just about documents. It became a prism for examining the dynamics of the Trump marriage itself. Meanwhile, advocacy groups seized the opening. Ethics watchdogs filed formal requests for reconciliations of travel and appearance expenses, while women's organizations framed the issue as labor invisibility, the work of projecting an image, written into a contract, yet publicly denied as labor at all. In industry circles, Hollywood writers pitched scripts around First Lady clauses, sensing both satire and social commentary. A reality TV producer quipped, "Contracts make better television than vows." The fallout also redefined Jasmine's image. She wasn't just another Democrat sparring in hearings. She became the lawmaker who pierced the First Lady's armor with a folder. Journalists framed her as fearless, critics called her reckless, but nobody ignored her. In a political landscape where silence was too often currency, Jasmine had chosen sound, and the echo reverberated everywhere. When the lights dimmed and the studio emptied, the echo of that folder still lingered. It wasn't about Melania alone. It wasn't about one marriage, one contract, or even one first lady. What Jasmine Crockett forced into the open was bigger. The question of who owes what to the public when power and privilege are paid for, at least in part, by the American people. That question is now stamped into the bloodstream of our politics, and it will not vanish with a press release. For decades, Americans have been told that certain corners of political life are sacred, untouchable, immune to scrutiny. Yet working families have never known that immunity. They balance receipts, endure audits, lose health care over paperwork, and scrape together savings with no cushion of secrecy. What Jasmine did was rip away the double standard. She showed, calmly and unmistakably, that if public money shields image, then public accountability must follow. That was the silence she broke, and the silence we cannot allow to return. The fallout has shown us two truths. First, when power is challenged with receipts, not rumors, the ground shifts. We witnessed it in the cultural storm online, in the letters from strangers, in the polls tilting uncomfortably away from business as usual. Second, the fight for transparency is not a one-night spectacle. It is a long campaign, fought not just in studios or Congress, but in classrooms, barbershops, churches, and dinner tables. Every debate that bloomed after that clip aired proved Americans are hungry for fairness, for rules that do not bend only for the privileged few. So what happens next is not up to Jasmine alone, it's up to us. Every time we share, every time we question, every time we demand the receipts from those who claim to serve us, we participate in the same work. This isn't about gossip or spectacle or scoring points. It's about protecting democracy from becoming theater for the powerful. The folder on the table was a symbol. The real work is making sure the questions it raised are answered everywhere, from the ballot box to the back row of a town hall. And here is where you come in. If you believe silence should never shield privilege, if you believe transparency matters, then don't just watch, act. Talk about this story. Ask the uncomfortable questions in your own circles. Share this video so the conversation doesn't stop where they want it to. And most of all, subscribe to this channel, because here we will continue to pull back the curtain, amplify the voices who demand more, and hold accountable those who believe their titles. History doesn't move because one person speaks. It moves because millions refuse to stop listening. Tonight, the silence was broken. Tomorrow you decide how loud the echo becomes.